The room was silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment. Cambridge University Hospital had become a second home to the brilliant physicist, confined to his wheelchair. What the world didn't know was that on that winter night in 1985, Hawking experienced something that would forever change his understanding of existence itself. The pneumonia that had attacked his already fragile body had pushed him to the very edge of mortality. As doctors rushed to stabilize his condition, Hawking felt himself slipping away, consciousness departing from the vessel that had both imprisoned and defined him for so many years. "I was aware of leaving my body behind," he would later confide to his nurse, Margaret, who had sworn to keep his experience private, not as a religious experience, but as a continuation of consciousness beyond what our current scientific understanding can explain. Whoa! What happened in those 9 minutes when his brain activity fluctuated between life and death would remain largely hidden from the public record. The man who had dedicated his life to unraveling the cosmos through equations and theory encountered something that transcended mathematical expression. It began with a sensation of expansion, read the private journal entry he dictated years later. "My consciousness seemed to spread outward, no longer confined to the limitations of my physical form. The boundaries that separate self from universe dissolved." In this state of expanded awareness, Hawking described encountering what he called the fundamental fabric of consciousness, a vast, interconnected web of awareness that seemed to underlie all of reality. This wasn't merely a hallucination produced by a dying brain, he insisted. It felt more real than physical reality itself. "I perceived consciousness not as a byproduct of brain activity, but as something fundamental to the universe, perhaps even more fundamental than space-time itself," he noted. "It was as though I could see that awareness is not generated by our brains, but rather channeled through them, like light through a prism." What troubled the physicist most about this experience was how it challenged his lifelong materialist worldview. The man who had once declared that we are just an advanced breed of monkeys on a minor planet of a very average star now found himself confronting evidence, subjective though it was, that consciousness might continue beyond bodily death. "If what I experienced was real," he pondered in recordings never meant for public consumption, "then we must reconsider everything we think we know about the nature of mind and its relationship to physical reality." The implications are staggering. For months after his recovery, Hawking immersed himself in quantum consciousness theories, requesting obscure papers from colleagues who wondered about his sudden interest in the field. The question that haunted him was deceptively simple. What if consciousness doesn't end when the brain stops functioning? "I believe that consciousness may be fundamental to the universe," he confided to a close colleague. "Not an emergent property of complex systems, but something woven into the very fabric of reality, something that exists independently of the physical structures through which it manifests." What Hawking witnessed during his near-death experience extended far beyond questions of consciousness. As he hovered in that liminal space between life and death, he perceived cosmic structures that defied all known physical theories, realities that couldn't be captured in the equations that had defined his life's work. "The universe I glimpsed wasn't the one I had spent decades studying," he later dictated into his private audio journal. "It was more vast, more intricate, and governed by principles that transcend our current understanding of physics." The most striking vision was what he described as a luminous web, an intricate network of light that seemed to connect everything in existence. This wasn't merely a visual phenomenon, but appeared to be the fundamental architecture of reality itself, existing beyond the 4 dimensions we typically perceive. This web of light wasn't metaphorical, he explained to Dr. Eleanor Hastings, a quantum physicist who had earned his trust. It appeared to be the actual underlying structure of the cosmos, a framework that supports both matter and consciousness, connecting them in ways our science hasn't begun to comprehend. The luminous filaments of this cosmic web pulsed with intelligence, responding to his awareness as if reality itself was conscious. As a theoretical physicist, Hawking had always approached the universe as something to be observed objectively, but in this state, the distinction between observer and observed completely dissolved. "I realized that we've been asking the wrong questions," he noted. "We've been seeking a theory of everything that unifies the fundamental forces, but we've neglected to consider that consciousness itself might be a fundamental force, perhaps the most fundamental of all. What particularly fascinated him was how this luminous web seemed to exist outside the constraints of time. Events that humans perceive as sequential, past, present, and future, appeared to exist simultaneously within this framework, challenging his previous understanding of temporal reality. Time as we understand it may be merely a perceptual limitation, he theorized. In this expanded state, I could see how events we consider separate are actually interconnected across what we perceive as time, a perspective that aligns with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, but extends far beyond them. The mathematical physicist who had revolutionized our understanding of black holes and cosmic origins found himself confronting a reality where mathematics itself seemed insufficient. The structures he witnessed appeared to operate according to principles that transcended numerical representation. Our current mathematical models are like trying to describe a symphony using only arithmetic, he reflected. They capture certain patterns and relationships, but miss the essential nature of the experience. Most surprising to Hawking was the discovery that this luminous web seemed to contain information, not abstract data, but something more akin to wisdom or meaning. It was as if the universe itself was a vast repository of knowledge, accessible to consciousness, that had freed itself from physical limitations. I had access to understanding that seemed to originate not from my own mind, but from the fabric of reality itself, he confided. Insights about the nature of existence flowed into my awareness without the laborious process of reasoning I had relied on throughout my scientific career. This experience left him with a profound question. What if the ultimate theory of everything couldn't be expressed through equations alone? What if understanding the deepest nature of reality required not just intellectual comprehension, but a direct experiential knowing? Perhaps what I glimpsed, he wrote in notes he kept hidden from colleagues, was not just another layer of physical reality, but the boundary where physics meets something else entirely, a domain where consciousness and cosmos are revealed as different aspects of the same underlying reality. As Hawking's consciousness continued to expand beyond the confines of his physical form, he became aware of something entirely unexpected, a presence, not a being in the conventional sense, but an intelligence that permeated the luminous web he had encountered, something both everywhere and precisely there with him. It wasn't anthropomorphic, he later dictated in recordings sealed in his private archives. This wasn't the bearded deity of religious tradition. What I encountered was far more profound, a field of intelligent awareness that seemed to be the foundation of existence itself. The presence communicated with him, though not through words or language as we understand them. Instead, understanding flowed directly into his consciousness, a pure transmission of meaning without the limitations of verbal expression. The exchange bypassed all linguistic structures, Hawking noted. It was as if meaning itself was being transferred directly to my awareness, a form of communication so efficient and complete that language seems crude by comparison. This encounter profoundly shook the physicist's long-held convictions. The man who had famously stated that there is no God found himself face to face with something that, while not matching religious descriptions of divinity, certainly suggested that intelligence and purpose existed at the fundamental level of reality. I've spent my life believing that the universe operates according to impersonal laws, he confessed to Dr. James Chen, a colleague who had become a confidant. But what if those laws themselves are expressions of something that can only be described as consciousness? What if awareness isn't just an emergent property of complex neural systems, but is woven into the very fabric of existence? The presence seemed to know him completely, not just his thoughts and memories, but the essence of who he was beyond his identity as a renowned physicist or his physical limitations. In that knowing, Hawking experienced something he had never encountered before: absolute acceptance. There was a sense of being fully comprehended, he explained, not judged or evaluated, but simply known in totality. The closest human analog might be unconditional love, though that term carries emotional baggage that doesn't quite capture the experience. What struck him most profoundly was how this presence seemed to exist both as something distinct that he could interact with and simultaneously as the ground of his own being, as if, at the deepest level, there was no separation between his consciousness and this cosmic intelligence. The boundaries we perceive between self and other may be more permeable than we realize, he theorized. In that state, I understood experientially what certain mystical traditions have claimed, that individual consciousness might be localized expressions of a universal awareness. The presence conveyed understandings that challenged not just his scientific worldview, but his entire conception of existence. It revealed that the physical universe, the domain of matter, energy, space, and time that science explores, is merely one level of a multi-layered reality far more complex than our current theories suggest. Our current physics is like studying the surface of the ocean while remaining unaware of its depths, he reflected. What I glimpsed was not just the waves, but the entire ocean and something of the nature of water itself. Most disconcerting to the scientist was the sense that this presence was not alien to him, but somehow intimately familiar, as if he was remembering rather than discovering something new. This suggested that human consciousness might have access to levels of reality beyond the physical, if only we knew how to attune to them. Perhaps what we call transcendent experiences are actually moments of expanded perception, he speculated. Brief glimpses of a more fundamental reality that our ordinary consciousness, bound to physical existence, filters out. The encounter left Hawking with a question that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. If such a presence exists at the foundation of reality, how might this change our understanding of not just physics, but meaning, purpose, and the nature of existence itself? I entered that experience as a materialist convinced that mind is merely what the brain does, he confided. I returned unable to dismiss the possibility that consciousness may be primary rather than secondary, that what we call matter might be a manifestation of something more fundamental that can only be described as mind. Upon returning to his physical body, Hawking was transformed by what he had witnessed at the threshold between life and death. His near-death journey had revealed aspects of reality that extended far beyond the boundaries of conventional physics, particularly regarding what happens in the moment of transition we call death. Death is not what we think it is, he dictated into his private recorder. What I perceived were not vague impressions, but what appeared to be actual laws governing the process of consciousness transitioning beyond physical form. These laws, as Hawking understood them, were not supernatural or mystical, but represented a higher-order physics, principles that operated at the intersection of consciousness and physical reality. They suggested that the moment of death follows patterns as precise and predictable as any other natural phenomenon. There seems to be a mathematics to dying, he noted, though it's expressed in dimensions our current mathematical language cannot adequately capture. It's as if consciousness follows specific trajectories as it releases from matter, geometries of transition that could potentially be mapped if we had the right conceptual framework. What fascinated him most was how these principles seem to reconcile the apparent contradiction between determinism and free will. The process appeared both perfectly ordered and yet responsive to the unique qualities of individual consciousness. The transition follows universal principles, yet each consciousness creates a unique pathway, he explained to Dr. Eileen Matthews, a theoretical physicist with whom he occasionally shared his most speculative thoughts. It's as if the universe provides the grammar, but each soul writes its own sentence. Hawking became convinced that these laws could eventually be understood scientifically, though such understanding would require a radical expansion of what we consider science. The current materialist paradigm, which excludes consciousness as a fundamental aspect of reality, was simply inadequate to the task. Humanity will eventually develop a science of consciousness that incorporates what I witnessed, he predicted. But this will require an epistemological revolution as significant as the quantum revolution of the early 20th century. We must become willing to consider that consciousness itself may be a primary rather than secondary phenomenon. Yet he also recognized that humanity wasn't ready for such knowledge. The implications would be too disruptive to our current scientific, philosophical, and religious frameworks. This explained his reluctance to speak publicly about his experience. To reveal what I witnessed would be irresponsible, he wrote. Not because the knowledge itself is dangerous, but because it would be profoundly misunderstood. Some would reject it outright as hallucination. Others would distort it to fit existing religious narratives, and the essential truth would be lost in the noise of interpretation. Instead, he decided to leave subtle clues in his later writings, hints that those with the appropriate background might recognize as pointing toward a more expansive understanding of consciousness and its relationship to physical reality. The questions I began asking in my later papers weren't arbitrary, he confided to a former student. They were breadcrumbs leading toward doorways I had glimpsed, but couldn't fully articulate within the constraints of current scientific discourse. In his final years, Hawking came to peace with the tension between what he had experienced and what he could publicly express. He understood that paradigm shifts in science happen gradually, and that the seeds he was planting might take generations to fully flower. Truth reveals itself in its own time, he reflected. My role is not to force a premature revolution, but to ensure that when humanity is ready to ask the right questions, some groundwork has been laid. Perhaps most profound was how this experience transformed Hawking's relationship with his own mortality. The man who had defied medical predictions by living decades with ALS found that his fear of death had been replaced by curiosity. I no longer see death as an ending, but as a transition governed by principles as elegant as those that govern the cosmos, he wrote in what would be his final private journal entry. When the time comes to leave this body behind once more, I will do so not in fear, but in recognition, like a traveler who, having glimpsed his destination on the horizon, finally arrives home. As his life drew to a close, Hawking kept his most profound discovery private, that consciousness, far from being extinguished at death, undergoes a transformation that follows precise, intelligible patterns that might someday be understood not as supernatural mysteries, but as expressions of the deepest laws of existence. In the end, he concluded, what I glimpsed in that space between life and death was not the absence of physics, but its fulfillment, a higher order reality where consciousness and cosmos reveal themselves as a single unified field of meaning. Death is not the end of the story. It is merely the turning of a page. If this journey into the mysteries beyond physics resonated with you, don't let the conversation end here. Hit the subscribe button now to explore more profound insights that challenge our understanding of consciousness and reality. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Have you ever wondered what lies beyond our physical existence? Your perspective matters in this cosmic conversation. Subscribe, comment, and join our community of seekers as we continue to explore the greatest mysteries of existence together.